This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Aaron Maté.
We turn now to the latest news in the NSA surveillance scandal. On Monday, both President Obama and whistleblower Edward Snowden gave extensive interviews on the surveillance program Snowden exposed, and Obama is now being forced to defend. Speaking to Charlie Rose on PBS, Obama drew a line between his surveillance efforts and those of the Bush administration. He also reaffirmed his insistence that no Americans' phone calls or emails are being directly monitored without court orders.
What I can say unequivocally is that if you are a U.S. person, the NSA cannot listen to your telephone calls, and the NSA cannot target your emails.
And have not.
And have not. They cannot and have not, by law and by rule, and unless they, and usually it wouldn't be they, it would be the FBI, go to a court and obtain a warrant and seek probable cause. The same way it's always been. The same way when we were growing up and we were watching movies, you want to go set up a wiretap, you got to go to a judge, show probable cause.
Obama's comments came as new poll numbers showed his approval rating has dipped 8% since the NSA disclosures emerged nearly 2 weeks ago. The drop was even higher among young voters, whose support for Obama fell 17 points. In his interview with PBS, President Obama was also asked about the potential extradition of whistleblower Edward Snowden. Obama referred questions to federal prosecutors, but said Snowden faces criminal investigation and possible extradition.
Well, after going public as the source behind the NSA disclosures just over a week ago, Edward Snowden reemerged on Monday after several days of quiet. In an online chat with the British newspaper The Guardian, Snowden rejected what he called smear efforts to paint him as a spy for China, saying he's had no contact with the Chinese government. He also defended his leaking of classified NSA documents, saying he deliberately chose not to reveal, quote, any U.S. operations against legitimate military targets, unquote. He added, I pointed out where the NSA has hacked civilian infrastructure, such as universities, hospitals, and private businesses, because it's dangerous. These nakedly aggressive criminal acts are wrong no matter the target, he wrote. Snowden indicated he remains in Hong Kong after arriving there last month, but wouldn't confirm his exact location. He also stood by his controversial assertion that he has, as an NSA contractor, had the capability to wiretap anyone in the U.S. with a personal email address. In comments suggesting he may be concerned his life is in danger, Snowden said more leaks are on the way, no matter what happens to him. He said, quote, all I can say right now is the U.S. government is not going to be able to cover this up by jailing or murdering me. Truth is coming out, and it cannot be stopped, he wrote. In the latest of Snowden's disclosures, The Guardian of London reported on Sunday the U.S. and Britain spied on foreign diplomats at 2 international summits in London during 2009. Britain's NSA counterpart, the GCHQ, established fake internet cafes to spy on foreign delegates' computer use, and the NSA shared information on phone calls of Russian leader Dmitry Medvedev. The revelation came just as the G8 summit opened in Ireland, with President Obama in attendance and Britain again playing host. All this comes as the Obama administration appears to be stepping up its effort to defend the surveillance program Snowden exposed. Before Obama's interview with PBS Monday, the National Security Agency disclosed it investigated less than 300 phone records seized in the broad collection of metadata last year. The agency also said the monitoring has foiled terror plots in the U.S. and 20 other countries and vowed to release details this week. The head of the National Security Agency, General Keith Alexander, is appearing before the House Intelligence Committee today in a rare public hearing. For more, we're going to Glenn Greenwald, the columnist for The Guardian of London, who broke the NSA surveillance story earlier this month and a number of others since, including Snowden coming forward as the NSA whistleblower. He's back home in Brazil after returning from Hong Kong, where Edward Snowden is believed to remain. On Monday, Glenn Greenwald moderated Snowden's online chat with The Guardian. Well, welcome back to Democracy Now!, Glenn. A lot has been happening. To say the least, you have been very busy. Talk about first, you moderated the discussion yesterday. What most surprised you, or I should say, what do you feel was most important about what Edward Snowden, the NSA whistleblower, wrote yesterday and was asked?
I think the key thing is that he continuously emphasizes that the caricature being made of him, that he's some kind of a spy or setting out to destroy the United States, is completely inconsistent with his behavior. He could have released all sorts of extremely damaging, even crippling documents if that had been his intention. He could have sold those documents to foreign adversaries if he wanted to enrich himself. None of those things were what he did. He instead very carefully vetted the documents that he turned over to us and some to the Washington Post, and urged us that we then conduct our own review to make sure that the documents that end up being published are ones that are truly in the public interest. And I think what you see here is a person who was very disturbed by this massive surveillance apparatus built in the United States that spies not only on American citizens but the world with very little checks, very little oversight. And he's making clear that his intention is to inform his fellow citizens, even at the expense of his own liberty or even life. And I think that comes through very clearly.
Well, Glenn, during his Guardian online chat, Snowden was asked to respond to the recent comments of former Vice President Dick Cheney. Speaking on Fox News, Cheney called Snowden a traitor who may be a Chinese spy.
Of Edward Snowden?
I think he's a traitor. I think he has committed crimes, in effect, by violating agreements given the position he had. He was a contractor employee, but he obviously had been granted top secret clearance. And I think it's one of the worst occasions in my memory of somebody with access to classified information doing enormous damage to the national security interests of the United States. Well, I'm deeply suspicious, obviously, because he went to China. That's not a place where you ordinarily want to go if you're interested in freedom and liberty and so forth. So it raises questions whether or not he had that kind of connection before he did this.
As for his response, Edward Snowden told the Guardian readers, quote, "This is a man who gave us the warrantless wiretapping scheme as a kind of atrocity warm-up on the way to deceitfully engineering the Iraq War that killed over 4,400 Americans and maimed nearly 32,000, as well as leaving over 100,000 Iraqis dead. Being called a traitor by Dick Cheney is the highest honor you can give an American." Glenn, what is your assessment of the criticism of Edward Snowden from both the right, as personified by Cheney, but also from liberals, from supporters of President Obama?
It's interesting because the criticism completely converges. In fact, I recall very well during the Bush years of 2006, 2007, when their NSA scandal was really raging, that exactly the same arguments were being made about those of us who were writing about these programs and those who had leaked them and the journalists who had published them, that they were traitors, that they were endangering national security, that they were engaged in all sorts of attempts to harm the United States. And it's amazing because back then you heard from Democrats, none of whom was saying that, and yet now under a Democratic president, of course, many of them are mimicking exactly those same beliefs. I mean, give Cheney at least some minimal credit that he's being consistently horrible, but at least consistent, in contrast to these Democrats who under Bush were very ardent critics of the surveillance state, of secrecy, of the idea that journalists are criminals or leakers are criminals, who now have completely done a 180 reversal now that it's a Democrat in office. And I can tell you that by far the most vehement and vicious attacks on our reporting and the stories that we've been writing come not from Republicans, but from Democratic partisans, both in politics and in the media.
Glenn, right now the G8 summit is taking place. Can you talk about the latest release from Ed Snowden about the U.S. and British governments using Internet cafes, phone taps, etc., to spy on G8, G20 delegates during the 2009 summit?
Sure. I didn't actually participate in that story, but the reason it was significant is not because it shows that the United States and Britain are spying, say, on the Russian president, which I think everybody expects and probably a lot of people want. The significance is twofold. One is that they are spying very aggressively on their own allies under the guise of inviting them to an economic summit. But I think the much bigger part of the story is it shows just how sophisticated and deceitful the eavesdropping capabilities are of Western governments and specifically of their intelligence and surveillance agencies. And so this is what I think is really the critical aspect of all of these stories, which is there are these extremely invasive capabilities being assembled by these governments that allow all kinds of deceitful spying, obviously ones that even trick the Russian government and the efforts to protect themselves from spying. And we ought to have, as part of our debate, an understanding of what these capabilities are so that we can have a real discussion about the kind of limits that should be imposed on them. So that's always what happens, is when these spying agencies create these capabilities, in the first instance they direct them at other governments, they direct them at hostile countries, but they always end up creeping further and further toward domestic surveillance. And we ought to know what these capabilities are so that we can anticipate them and plan for them and talk about ways to limit them and prevent abuse.
Well, Glenn, I've read some criticism of Snowden and your reporting, drawing a distinction between exposing domestic surveillance and then blowing the whistle on foreign espionage, saying that they're separate, and that, in fact, talking about programs like this one that was uncovered in Britain, spying on foreign leaders, distracts from the issue of domestic spying.
So I think there's a continuum here. You know, the journalistic inquiry is there a significant public interest, and does it outweigh whatever harm you might cause? And so on the continuum of what's in the public interest, I think that at the very top end of that spectrum in terms of public interest is when a government engages in massive surveillance on its own citizens without suspicion or evidence of wrongdoing, which is what most of our stories have focused on. I think after that comes when the governments of the United States and its allies are spying on citizens of the world without suspicion. There is a huge loss to privacy, internet freedom, liberty, when the NSA spies on innocent people who aren't Americans, who live in other countries as well. And then I think at the far end of that continuum on the other spectrum is when governments spy on other governments. So I agree that the public interest there is less than it is when the NSA spies domestically, but it's not non-existent. As I said, we need to know what these capabilities are so that we can act before they start being applied domestically. But the vast bulk of our stories have been and will continue to be stories about how the NSA directs its surveillance at Americans and citizens around the world indiscriminately, without any evidence of wrongdoing, what Mr. Snowden yesterday called the largest suspicionless surveillance program ever created in human history.
So let's go to what President Obama said in the Charlie Rose interview, when he said he could say unequivocally that we're not listening to your phone calls. It says the NSA cannot listen to your phone calls, Obama said. The NSA cannot target your emails and have not unless they get a subpoena. Can you talk about that?
I'm staggered by how deceitful and misleading that claim is from President Obama. It's actually worse than just misleading and deceitful. It's just outright false. And this is the story that we're working on to publish next, which is an inside look at what the FISA court really does in terms of what is called oversight, but is really an empty fig leaf when it monitors the NSA. Under the 2008 FISA law, which replaced the 30-year FISA law enacted in 1978, the principal change is that the United States no longer needs an individual warrant when it listens in on the telephone calls or reads the emails of American citizens when they communicate with people outside of the United States. It is true that when American citizens talk to other Americans on U.S. soil, exclusively domestic communications, the NSA legally is required to get an individualized warrant from the FISA court before they can listen to the content of those communications. But when an American citizen is talking to somebody outside of the United States who's not a U.S. citizen, and the target of those communications is the person outside of the United States, that is now completely legal for the NSA to eavesdrop on that call or read the email without going and getting a warrant. That is the whole point of that 2008 law. Remember, the Bush administration in 2005 got caught eavesdropping on the conversations of American citizens, the international conversations of American citizens, without a warrant. And what that 2008 law did is legalize that Bush program by eliminating the warrant requirement. And so every 6 months, the NSA goes to the FISA court and they say, here are the procedures that we use for determining who is and is not a U.S. citizen, who is and is not on U.S. soil. The FISA court stamps an approval stamp on those guidelines, and the NSA is then empowered to go around collecting whatever calls and whatever emails they want. They can force the telecoms and the internet providers to give them whatever content they want, which often includes American citizens talking to these foreign targets without any kind of a search warrant. So when President Obama says nobody's listening to your calls or reading your emails without first getting a search warrant, that is absolutely false. It is true that the NSA can't deliberately target U.S. citizens for that kind of surveillance, but it is also the case that they are frequently engaging in surveillance of exactly that kind of invasive technique involving U.S. persons. Let me just say one last thing. This is why, and just go to Google and read about this, Ron Wyden and Mark Udall, two Democrats on the Intelligence Committee, have been repeatedly asking the NSA, how many Americans' telephone calls and emails are you intercepting without warrants under this program? And the NSA continuously tells them, I'm sorry, we can't provide you with even a rough estimate. We don't have the technical capabilities to do that. It would take too much time and distract away from our core mission for us to assemble those statistics. So this idea that President Obama is promoting that the NSA never listens to Americans' calls or reads their emails without warrants is utterly false.
Glenn, we have to break for just 30 seconds, but we want to come back and play another clip for you of President Obama speaking on Charlie Rose on PBS on Monday night. Glenn Greenwald, of course, is the award-winning journalist who has broken the NSA leak story on Edward Snowden, who's come forward as the whistleblower who released a tremendous amount of information about the NSA and his role as a consultant working in an NSA office in Hawaii as a consultant for Booz Allen Hamilton. This is Democracy Now! We'll be back with Glenn Greenwald in just 30 seconds.